I remember the first time I saw the old factory. It was a relic of a bygone era, its skeletal frame looming over the town like a silent sentinel. The townsfolk whispered about it, tales of its dark past woven into the fabric of our community. But none of us, not even in our wildest dreams, could have predicted the horror that would unfold in its shadow. My name is Sarah, and I've lived in this town my entire life. It's a place where everyone knows everyone, where secrets are hard to keep, yet somehow they do. When the first body was found, it was like a stone dropped into the still waters of our lives, sending ripples of fear and suspicion through every street. The victim was Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who lived alone in one of those old houses near the factory. She was found in her garden, her body posed as if she were merely sleeping. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry. It was eerie, unsettling. The town buzzed with theories, but no answers. Then, another disappearance. This time, it was young Emily, a girl who worked at the local diner. She vanished after her shift, her car still parked in the lot. The pattern was becoming disturbingly clear. Ordinary people, living in those old houses, disappearing without a trace. We, a group of old friends, started to notice the connections. Each of us had a tie to the factory, to the time when it was bustling with life. Memories we had buried deep began to claw their way back to the surface. There was Jake, who had worked there as a teenager, Laura, whose father was one of the last managers before the factory shut down, and me, whose grandfather had been part of the union that fought for better conditions. The disappearances weren't random. They were too deliberate, too precise. It was as if someone knew exactly who to target and when. One morning, I was walking down Main Street, the crisp autumn air biting at my cheeks, when I saw Jake. He was leaning against the old oak tree, his face etched with worry. I approached him, and before I could even say hello, he handed me a crumpled piece of paper. "Found this in my mailbox," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I unfolded it, my hands trembling slightly. It was a photograph, faded and worn, of a group of workers standing in front of the factory. Among them, I recognized Jake, much younger, and my grandfather, his face stern, his eyes piercing even through the photograph. On the back, in scrawling handwriting, was a message, "Remember what you did." My heart sank. The past was catching up with us, and it wasn't just memories anymore. Later that day, we gathered at Laura's house, a quaint cottage with ivy creeping up its walls. The atmosphere was tense, the usual warmth replaced by a palpable sense of dread. Laura's eyes were red, likely from crying, or lack of sleep, or both. "We need to talk about this," she started, her voice shaky. "This isn't just about the factory or our past. This is about our lives now." Jake nodded, pulling out more letters he had received, all anonymous, all cryptic, hinting at secrets we thought were long buried. "We've got to figure out who's behind this," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "But we need to be careful. Whoever this is, they know us, our routines, our secrets." The discussion was cut short by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. We all froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. It was just the mailman, but the fear had already taken root. As the days passed, the town's unease grew. More letters appeared, each one more ominous than the last. The local sheriff, an old friend of my father's, was at a loss. There were no leads, No witnesses, just the chilling silence of the factory looming over us all. One evening, as I was locking up the diner, after a long shift, I noticed something odd. A shadow moved near the old factory, too deliberate to be an animal or a trick of the light. I squinted, my heart racing, but it was gone as quickly as I had seen it. The next day, another disappearance was reported. This time, it was Mr. Daniels, the local librarian, another resident of those old houses. The pattern was undeniable now, and the fear was no longer just a whisper. It was a shout that echoed through our streets. We knew we had to act, but every step we took felt like we were walking into a trap. The past was not just haunting us, it was hunting us. And with each new disappearance, the net seemed to tighten around us. The once peaceful town, now a stage for a sinister play, where we were both the actors and the audience. The tension in the town was palpable, a thick fog of fear that clung to every corner. We decided to meet again, this time at Jake's place, a modest home that sat on the edge of the forest, away from prying eyes. The living room was dimly lit. The only sound was the crackling of the fireplace, casting long shadows that danced eerily on the walls. "We need to go back to the factory," Jake said, his voice firm, but his eyes betraying his anxiety. "There's something there, something we missed." Laura shook her head, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of her hair. "But what if we're walking into exactly what they want? What if we're playing into their hands?" I looked at them both, feeling the weight of our shared history pressing down on me. "We have no choice. We're running out of time, and people are disappearing. If there's even a chance that the answers are there, we have to take it." The decision was made, but the fear was real. We agreed to meet at dawn, when the town was still asleep, to minimize the risk of being seen. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind, seemed like a warning, a reminder of the danger we were about to face. At dawn, the sky was a bleak gray, mirroring the mood as we gathered at the factory's rusted gates. The place looked even more menacing in the half-light, its dark windows like empty eyes watching us. Jake led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as we navigated through the debris and overgrowth. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Inside, the factory was a labyrinth of shadows and echoes of its past. We found an old office, untouched by time, where papers were strewn about as if someone had left in a hurry. Among them, we found documents detailing layoffs, union disputes, and a list of names, some crossed out, others circled. "Look at this," Laura whispered, holding up a faded ledger. "These are the names of the victims and some of our parents." The realization hit us like a cold wave. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about retribution for something that happened decades ago. But what? As we sifted through more documents, a noise from deeper within the factory startled us. We turned off our flashlights, plunging into darkness, listening intently. "Hello," Jake called out, his voice echoing off the metal walls. Silence answered back, but then a soft, almost imperceptible shuffle. We moved cautiously, following the sound. In a secluded corner, hidden behind a stack of old crates, we found a makeshift room, photos of the victims, maps of the town, and newspaper clippings about the factory's closure were pinned to the walls. In the center, a table held a collection of personal items from the disappeared, Emily's necklace, Mrs. Thompson's gardening gloves, Mr. Daniel's reading glasses. This isn't just about us, I murmured, the pieces falling into place. It's about everyone who ever wronged the factory or its workers. The gravity of our discovery was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching rapidly. We scrambled, hiding just as a figure entered the room. It was someone we knew, someone from our past, but not someone we expected. The figure paused, looking around, then began to rearrange the items on the table, almost lovingly. My heart pounded in my chest as I recognized the face, now older, but unmistakably familiar. It was then I realized, with a chilling certainty, that the killer was someone who had been wronged by the factory, someone who had been watching us, waiting for the right moment. The connection wasn't just to our past, but to a shared pain, a vendetta that had festered over years. We needed to act, but how? The figure was meticulous, leaving no trace, no evidence. As they left the room, we knew we had to follow, to confront this specter from our past, but the fear of what might happen next was overwhelming. We were not just uncovering a killer. We were unearthing a history of betrayal and vengeance that had been buried for too long, and now it was coming for us. The figure moved with a deliberate slowness, each step echoing through the hollow chambers of the factory. We stayed hidden, our breaths shallow, as the reality of our situation sank in. This wasn't just about solving a mystery. It was about confronting a ghost of our collective past, a ghost that had now taken on flesh and blood. As the figure left the room, Jake whispered, "We can't let them get away. We need to know why." Laura's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded. "We follow, but we stay together. No one goes alone." We crept out from our hiding place, the cold metal of the factory walls chilling us to the bone. The figure was ahead, a silhouette against the dim light filtering through broken windows. We followed at a distance, our hearts pounding, in unison with the rhythmic clanging of metal underfoot. The path led us deeper into the factory, into areas we had never explored before, where the air was thick with the dust of forgotten years. Here, the remnants of machinery stood like silent witnesses to the factory's heyday and its subsequent fall. Suddenly, the figure stopped, turning around as if sensing our presence. We ducked behind a rusted conveyor belt, our breathing the only sound in the oppressive silence. After a moment, they continued, leading us to an old boiler room, its door slightly ajar. Peering through the crack, we saw the figure sit down at a makeshift desk cluttered with more papers, photographs, and what looked like old journals. They began to write, their movements meticulous, almost ritualistic. Jake signaled for us to move closer, and we did, inching our way to a better vantage point. From here, we could see the face clearly, the lines etched deep by time and bitterness. It was Mr. Carter, the former union leader, a man whose life had been shattered when the factory closed. "Why would he do this?" Laura whispered, her voice trembling. I shook my head, my mind racing. Maybe he thinks he's righting some wrong, but at what cost? The room was filled with the evidence of his obsession. Newspaper articles about the factory's closure, personal letters from workers, and detailed notes on each victim. It was clear. This wasn't just revenge. It was a mission, a twisted sense of justice. Jake's hand tightened around the flashlight, his jaw set. We need to confront him, now, before he does anything else. We stepped into the room, the door creaking ominously as we entered. Mr. Carter looked up, his eyes narrowing as he recognized us. There was no surprise in his gaze, only a resigned acceptance. "You've come to stop me," he stated, his voice steady, devoid of emotion. "But you're too late." Jake stepped forward, his voice firm. "Why, Mr. Carter? Why are you doing this?" Mr. Carter's eyes, once sharp with the fire of youth, now dulled by years of bitterness, met ours. "You want to know why? Because justice was never served. When the factory closed, it wasn't just jobs that were lost. Lives were destroyed, families torn apart, and those responsible walked away, unscathed." I felt a chill run down my spine. But killing innocent people isn't justice. It's vengeance. He laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. "Innocent? No one here is innocent. Each of these victims, their families, they all played a part in the downfall. They turned their backs when we needed them most." Laura's voice was barely a whisper. "But what about Emily, Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Daniels? They had nothing to do with the factory's closure." Mr. Carter's gaze hardened. "They lived in those houses, houses built on the bones of our livelihoods. They benefited from our pain, even if indirectly. They are symbols of what was taken from us." The room felt suffocating, the weight of his words pressing down on us. "So, you're punishing the town for the sins of a few?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's not punishment. It's a reminder of what happens when greed and neglect go unchecked, when you forget the people who made this town what it was." Jake's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. "This has to stop, Mr. Carter. You've taken enough." Mr. Carter stood up, his figure looming over the desk. "It will stop when I say it stops. When the town remembers, when they feel the loss as we did." The tension snapped like a taut wire. Jake lunged forward, but Mr. Carter was quicker, pulling out a revolver from his desk drawer. "I won't let you interfere." Laura screamed, and in that moment, chaos erupted. I grabbed a heavy ledger from the desk, throwing it towards Mr. Carter. It hit his arm, causing the gun to fire, the bullet ricocheting off the metal walls. In the confusion, Jake tackled him, and they both went down, struggling on the ground. I rushed to help, pulling at Mr. Carter's arms while Laura tried to disarm him. The gun skidded across the floor, out of reach. With a final heave, we managed to pin Mr. Carter down. His face was contorted with rage and despair. "You don't understand," he gasped, his voice breaking. "You never will." The struggle ended as quickly as it had begun, leaving us all breathless and shaken. Mr. Carter lay on the cold, dusty floor, his chest heaving with the exertion of our confrontation. The revolver lay several feet away, its presence a stark reminder of how close we had come to tragedy. Jake, his face flushed with the adrenaline of the fight, stood up, his eyes never leaving Mr. Carter. "It's over," he said, his voice a mix of relief and sorrow. Laura, tears streaming down her face, retrieved the gun, ensuring it was safely out of reach. "We need to call the sheriff," she said, her voice quivering. I nodded, pulling out my phone, my hand still trembling from the encounter. As I dialed, I looked at Mr. Carter, his eyes now filled with a mix of defeat and a strange, lingering defiance. The sheriff arrived shortly, his face grim. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment if you enjoyed this story. This will help us create more engaging stories for you.